Welcome to the podcast. You know what's going on. I'm your host, Casey. This is the Godward Show, and it's the Meister Eckhart episode. The German theologian and mystic Meister Eckhart was born in the Holy Roman Empire in the year 1260 A.D. Although the empire was still unified, not counting the schism with the East, there were tensions. By the time he was in his late 30s, the period of the Avignon papacy was happening, where 7 popes in a row resided there rather than in Rome, and there were disagreements between various orders of monks, the Franciscans and the Dominicans. The accusation of heresy came when Eckhart was in his 50s, and he seems to have died before any conclusive verdict was reached. His reputation started to recover in the 19th century, but his status is still rather uncertain in the contemporary Catholic Church. Some have advocated for removing the standing censure on him. Others have been more hesitant, essentially trusting earlier judgments of the Church. That's about all I'll say on his biography. It is an interesting read, of course. What I want to do with my time here is to sort of sample some of his writings and try to give you a taste of why he's one of the best-selling mystics you can find in the 21st century. He's right up there now with Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross and other legends. The writings that survive are mostly sermons and commentary on various biblical texts. The fact that his writings were preserved rather than burned seems to be an argument in his favor, I suppose. The volume I have here, you can see on your screens, contains about half of his German vernacular writings. Although I should also note that the majority of his published theological writings were composed in Latin. The preface to my edition suggests that Eckhart had a tendency to become or be less orthodox when speaking in German or his vernacular, while he was more orthodox and disciplined in his Latin writings. So this is going to be a pretty exciting episode, actually, but also potentially overwhelming. Eckhart's sermons seem to progress toward a climax of thinking, which is sort of finally stated in Sermon 28, at least as they're numbered according to this edition, and it's that sermon that I'm going to study with you here. The difficulty is that I've read the first 27, and so it's impossible, it may be impossible for you to understand the whole thing without reading the first 27, and I'm going to do my best here to kind of summarize those, or at least not leave you in the dust. But like I said, the difficulty is I have read those, and so it's possible I'm more accustomed to Eckhart's line of thinking. And there are sort of special or technical terms that you have to kind of acquire through, steady reading to better understand his vocabulary and his thinking. And of course, they're in German, so I'm reading a translation here in English. But I'll try to stay aware of all this and use my own vernacular as much as possible in this episode. So, Sermon 28 is a meditation on the famous text from Matthew 5:3. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Eckhart quotes it in Latin, by the way, of course. I think it's worth reminding everybody that Luke's gospel omits in spirit when it reports its own version of Jesus' Beatitudes. Eckhart begins by saying, look, this is no mistake. Wisdom itself gave these words to Jesus, who spoke the eternal wisdom of the Father. And the point is, as strange and even as contradictory as this saying seems, we can be certain, because we are certain that Scripture is true, that it is a true saying. The poor in spirit really are blessed. Don't doubt it. But, though it is true, it is curiously true, and it demands an explanation. This text is perfect grist for Eckhart's mill because it provides him with a foundation for his argument, and his argument hinges on the idea of a particular kind of difference between the external and the internal, or the exoteric and the esoteric. To discover and articulate this principle, Eckhart begins by briefly honoring physical poverty or external poverty, especially when it is taken on voluntarily. He notes that Jesus Christ himself practiced this kind of poverty in the earthly realm, but Eckhart is going to show that although external poverty is or can be virtuous, inward poverty of spirit can be an even higher virtue. And these things need not be counterpoised, by the way. Thus, there is no contradiction between Matthew and Luke. Eckhart pivots very quickly in this essay to the other kind of poverty, the spiritual kind, the inner kind. He begins by praying that his auditors may be like this, so that you may understand this address. Already, that's a rather mystical thing to say. The idea seems to be that only those who are already poor in spirit will be able to understand the sermon. Remember, the poor in spirit are blessed. He then defines poor in spirit with a nifty little paragraph. It says this, quote, Bishop Albert says, "To be poor is to take no pleasure in anything God ever created." And that is well said. But we shall say it better and take poverty in a higher sense. He is a poor man who wants nothing, knows nothing, and has nothing. I shall speak of these 3 points. So, okay, now we're getting to it. To begin to make sense of the claim that the poor in spirit are blessed, Eckhart offers a very sharp definition. This blessed man is poor in the sense that he wants nothing. And I have to say that here, having read the sermons leading to this one, and having done a good amount of reading about Buddhism and Hinduism in the old days, I thought immediately of the 4 noble truths articulated by Buddha here. If this strikes some of you as heretical or an iffy leap to make, please understand that my take on Buddhism is that it is effectively psychology. So if you review the 4 noble truths with me for just a second and understand that they need not involve theological claims, and I don't think they need to seem contradictory to Christianity, I think then this can be kind of beneficial. At least, I mean, not if you take them sort of out of context, right? Like, I know there are variations in Buddhism where I'm sure they're chanting these doctrines, and if you do the chant the wrong way or something, you end up reincarnated the wrong way or whatever. But throw that stuff out and just think of the sort of psychological truth of the 4 noble truths. So, first, the truth of suffering. That is to say, like, suffering is real, it's not an illusion, it really happens, life isn't perfect, that kind of stuff. 2, the truth of the origin of suffering, okay, and that is desire. So basically, like, all of your suffering in your life, according to Buddha, can be explained because you desire something before the suffering, right? So like, you desire to not suffer, or you desire to have a fancy car and you don't get it, and so on. The 3rd noble truth is the truth of the cessation of suffering. That is, the truth that suffering can be brought to an end if, and of course, well, if you can cease desire, something like that. And that's number 4, the way of the cessation of suffering. Okay, so that's sort of complicated Buddhism. That's the 8-fold path, the virtues, etc. But hopefully what you see in that is a kind of psychology, which is that, like, yeah, your suffering, your sin, you might say, in Christianity is caused by this kind of desire for something other than what is. So something like that. So in these, anyway, I think we see a precursor to the kind of thinking that Eckhart is doing. He's thinking very much about the gospel, of course, about the Beatitudes, and always about Christian theology. But within that, Eckhart perceives a strain of important psychological teaching that he suggests is very easy to miss. And for what it's worth, I think he's exactly right. Eckhart says, quote, "Some people do not understand very well what this means. They are people who continue very properly in their penances and external practices of piety. And then he says in parentheses, popularly considered of great importance, may God pardon it. And still they know very little of the divine truth. To all outward appearances, these people are to be called holy, but inwardly they are asses, for they understand not at all the true meaning of the divine reality. Let's go, fellow esotericists. You know what I mean? Like, I love that stuff. The Lent observers are eternally BTFO'd here. Eckhart continues to flog these outwardly pious types over the next few paragraphs, but the essence of it is this, and this is a sentence from his sermon, quote, as long as a person keeps his own will and thinks it his will to fulfill the all-loving will of God, he has not really that poverty of which we are talking. Well, I do think we got to really mull this over here. I mean, it immediately reminds me of the gut-wrenching prayer that Jesus mutters in the Garden of Gethsemane on the night of his arrest. Father, take this cup of suffering from me, but not my will, but thy will be done. I mean, what an enormously courageous prayer that is, right? I've said this before, but I mean, all of us want the suffering to end. That's the easy part of the prayer. Take this cup of suffering from me. Anytime you're hurting or you feel ousted or isolated or sad or whatever, you might pray to God, like, take this cup of suffering from me. But the second part of that prayer, which is to say, not my will, but thy will be done, basically undermines the first part. It's amazing, right? Wow. I mean, he's basically saying, God, please don't make me get nailed up on a cross. It's going to hurt and I don't like that. But actually, never mind, do whatever you think is best, right? I mean, who would have the balls to pray that second part of that prayer? Wow. And so this, for Eckhart, is the very essence of spiritual poverty. Eckhart uses the image of a baby in the womb to communicate how one would have to desire and or will if one would be spiritually poor. And that is to say, not at all, right? Even the idea of God, ultimately, is paradoxically a kind of interruption of this perfect spiritual poverty, if it is desired as a thing outside of oneself. Why is it a paradox? I sort of stumbled on my words there. It's a paradox because, like, we think teaching people about God and giving them the idea of God is going to help them, but Eckhart says, in the last analysis, that idea can itself become kind of a barrier. You think you know, and because you think you know, you can't sort of punch on through to the other side. You have to get to a point where unknowing is where you are, okay? And so all pride of knowledge must also be brought to an end if one is to arrive at this state of being. Listen again to Eckhart make a remarkable point, quote, he is poor who knows nothing. We have sometimes said that a man ought to live as if he did not live, neither for self, nor for the truth, nor for God. But to that point we shall say something else and go further. The man who is to achieve this poverty shall live as having what was his when he did not live at all, neither his own, nor the truth, nor God. More, maybe I meant quit or quiet, and empty of all knowledge, so that no knowledge of God exists in him. For when a man's existence is of God's eternal species, there is no other life in him. His life is himself. Therefore we say that a man ought to be empty of his own knowledge, as he was when he did not exist, and let God achieve what he will, and be as untrammeled by humanness as he was when he came from God. End quote. I mean, try to imagine this with me for a minute if you can. Even rewind that and listen to it again and read along on the screen. This is the cusp of like a psychedelic state, it seems to me. There will be no desire here because there will be no knowledge. Here I recall Socrates' statement in the Apology about why he does not fear death. I didn't look it up this time, but as I remember it, he said simply, no one has brought back reliable information about what death is. So we simply don't know whether it is a good thing or a bad thing. So I no more fear it than I do desire it, right? It's related to this. Have you heard the parable of the Chinese farmer? I'm going to insert Alan Watts' telling of it here.
Once upon a time, there was a Chinese farmer who lost a horse, ran away. And all the neighbors came around that evening and said, that's too bad. And he said, maybe. The next day, the horse came back and brought 7 wild horses with it. And all the neighbors came around and said, why, that's great, isn't it? And he said, maybe. The next day, his son was attempting to tame one of these horses and was riding it and was thrown and broke his leg. And all the neighbors came around in the evening and said, well, that's too bad, isn't it? And the farmer said, maybe. And the next day, the conscription officers came around looking for people for the army, and they rejected his son because he had a broken leg. And all the neighbors came around that evening and said, isn't that wonderful? And he said, maybe. The whole process of nature is an integrated process of immense complexity, and it is really impossible to tell whether anything that happens in it is good or bad.
Well, I mean, can anyone live like this? Like, what is the lesson of that video, right? Can you get to so neutral a state when it comes to what's going on in your life that you have no preferences? You know, for example, like, do you have a desire to travel or to grow a fine dogwood tree in your backyard or to eat a juicy fillet? You know, what about this? Do you desire to have a raise or even merely to keep your job? Do you desire a certain social status among your peers or merely not to be ostracized? Do you desire the well-being of your family or even life over and above death? Do you desire to know the nature of reality, to know God, to get to heaven? All of these desires, according to Eckhart, indicate a lack of perfect spiritual poverty. And possessed by these desires, a man cannot receive the blessing Jesus speaks of in Matthew 5:3. So if you want to be blessed, blessed are the poor in spirit, you got to get this stuff. Now, listen to this incredible paragraph. I mean, this is some amazing writing. Quote, now the question is raised. In what does happiness consist most of all? Certain authorities have said that it consists in loving. Others say that it consists in knowing and loving, and this is a better statement. But we say that it consists neither in knowledge nor in love, but in that there is something in the soul from which both knowledge and love flow, and which, like the agents of the soul, neither knows nor loves. Still Eckhart here. To know this is to know what blessedness depends on. This something has no before or after, and it waits for nothing that is yet to come, for it has nothing to gain or lose. Thus, when God acts in it, it is deprived of knowing that he has done so. What is more, it is the same kind of thing that, like God, can enjoy itself. Thus I say that a man should be so disinterested and untrammeled that he does not know what God is doing in him. Thus only can a person possess that poverty. Imagine that, you guys. Like, imagine God working in you and you not even being aware of it, not knowing it. In this state of being, you wouldn't will anything because you wouldn't know what you should be willing. Like, you shouldn't know what to will because you don't even know God or of God. There's a kind of total unknowing in Eckhart's schema here. And does this sound heretical? I mean, I don't know. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. Go back to my Dante episode for a minute if you can find it. Maybe I'll try to pull this up here. And if that worked right, I tried to insert the part that I probably did in that episode. I don't remember exactly, where I tried to describe the reversal that happens in the very bottom of hell. Total disorientation. At the very pit of hell, that's where you go, right? You don't know which way is up. You see, you can't get blessed by God if you think you know God. It only comes to the one who is in a state of total Aphoria, according to Eckhart. And like I said, I don't know whether the Catholic Church can take this in, whether this sort of rhetoric is like technically heretical or not, but it's easy to understand why it's so controversial, such a hot potato. Eckhart challenges the very idea that authoritative teaching about God can even exist. He essentially deconstructs any confidence you might have that you know what God is. Listen again. Quote, "The authorities say that God is a being, an intelligent being who knows everything. But I say that God is neither a being nor intelligent, and he does not know either this or that. God is free of everything, and therefore he is everything. He, then, who is to be poor in spirit must be poor of all his own knowledge, so that he knows nothing of God, or creatures, or of himself. This is not to say that one may not desire to know and to see the way of God, but it is to say that he may thus be poor in his own knowledge." There are about 2 more pages in this sermon that I haven't summarized yet. It's a really difficult thing to try to articulate the last couple of pages here. Basically, it's a warning against trying or like making an effort. And that might sound bizarre to those of you who believe that effort is required in salvation. But if you remember Paul's writings, you can look these up in 1 Corinthians 15:10 or in Galatians 2:20 and elsewhere. I think in parts of Romans 7, for example. You might begin to get a sense of what Eckhart is pointing at here. The gist of it is, if you hear this sermon and believe that you are convinced of it, and therefore try to carve out a space inside yourself to allow God to act in you, then, almost more than ever, you're not getting it. And you're not spiritually poor, according to Eckhart. Eckhart says, quote, "Thus we say that a man should be so poor that he is not and has not a place for God to act in. To reserve a place would be to maintain distinctions." And the language here gets so exciting, so wild. Eckhart has said that God is one who acts within himself. And so it's in that vein that he sort of pronounces here. And this is nearing the end. He says, quote, "Therefore I pray God that he may quit me of God. For unconditioned being is above God and all distinctions. It was here, in unconditioned being, that I was myself, wanted myself, and knew myself to be this person here before you. And therefore I am my own first cause, both of my eternal being and of my temporal being. To this end I was born, and by virtue of my birth being eternal, I shall never die. I was my own first cause, as well as the first cause of everything else. If I had willed it, neither I nor the world would have come to be. If I had not been, there would have been no God. There is, however, no need to understand this." End quote. I mean, wow. And he concludes by stating it even more directly and succinctly, quote, "I discover that God and I are one." This is straight up John 10:30 level, and in my mind, it is a credit to the Catholic Church that they didn't quite call for his death the way the Pharisees called for Jesus' death when he said the same thing. To be honest, it feels almost risky to even summarize Meister Eckhart, because to present oneself as being an understander of Eckhart is basically to claim to have known firsthand the experience about which he speaks. And once you get to that point, you're basically making the same sort of very big claim that he seems to have been making. there does seem to be something about like self-awareness or self-consciousness that saves one from the persecution faced by Jesus himself or by other mystic martyrs of Christian history, or by like al-Hallaj in the Muslim tradition, where, for example, where these guys seemed indifferent to how any audience might receive their claims and paid no attention to any threats of persecution. I mark in myself a severe hesitation to say anything that I can't take back, I try to maintain a plausible deniability, and I prefer cryptic speech about the esoteric things. I say, hey, I read this in William James, stuff like that. And perhaps this strain of self-consciousness remained with Eckhart also. The very last few sentences of this sermon essay are very self-aware, and they show that he was, again, very conscious of how strange his teachings may have seemed to his listeners. He says at the end of Sermon 28, quote, "If anyone does not understand this discourse, let him not worry about that, for if he does not find this truth in himself, he cannot understand what I have said. For it is a discovered truth which comes immediately from the heart of God, that we may all so live as to experience it eternally. May God help us. Amen." And yep, all I can add here is like, amen, brother. You know what I mean? That's kind of the end of this stuff. I mean, mysticism is a fun thing to think about. It's very hard to talk about. I mean, I guess like I'm gonna wrap it here pretty soon. I by the way, I am gonna do my next episode, I think, on Flannery O'Connor's short story. I don't know which one I'm gonna do. I was gonna do. There's a bunch of them, but I'm not even gonna name it yet. I'll just surprise you with which of her stories. But I watched a documentary about her on PBS last week that was very good. One of those American Masters series. And you get the sense that, like, I mean, sort of not jokingly, my wife and I call her a saint, because what we mean is that, like, you can't think the thoughts she thinks unless you've been out beyond the buoys, in some ways. And so, like, I was gonna do a very like gimmicky. I'll actually insert it here. A very gimmicky thumbnail for this episode that I decided not to use. And you can see why it's gimmicky here. It's right. It's to make a couple of claims that basically, like, God is not like something that can be contained in a thought. So God is not what you think, which is also to say, for some of us at least, God is not what you think he is. And instead of that, what is he? Well, he is, right? He is. And isness, like, precedes definitions and all that stuff. And so, like, God, at some level, God, at least for Eckhart, is an ineffable, it's closer to an experience. And when you start thinking in these terms, you may start referring to God as an it rather than a he. Although you don't have to. I mean, but these kinds of things are not unknown in the language and rhetoric of, mystics. And all I'll say about it is that at a certain point in my life, like after a certain degree of spiritual attainment or experience or something, like after that, in a way that had not existed within me before that, I was able to recognize in the writings of certain others phrases that would have not only baffled me before that, but like basically been invisible to me before that. That's the curious thing about it, is that once you've kind of punched on through, you've seen that image of it's one of the first images that comes up if you type in like mystical image or something like that, of that guy poking his head outside the edge of the universe and kind of peeking, the reality, or like outside the cave or whatever. But like, if you just get one glimpse of that, then afterwards, certain phrases and manners of expression and so on appear just very clearly to be kind of like hints about that place, or that, call it whatever you want, mental or emotional space or experience. But at least as I remember it, before you punch through it yourself, and before you find this truth for yourself, or it comes to you and reveals itself to you, you sort of just can't make out this kind of writing. So there's that weird contradiction where he says at the end, like, basically, if you don't understand this, like, don't worry about it, because you're not going to, like, learn anything from listening to this sermon. But what you might find, if you have experienced the thing yourself, if you have found the thing yourself, is that, like, others also have experienced it themselves, and they'll kind of try to write about it. And after the experience, you can kind of recognize it. There's like a shared way of hinting about it, and it's like a wink between the lines or something that I find exists in the likes of Meister Eckhart and Julian of Norwich and I was going to say Plotinus. I mean, that would be interesting, wouldn't it? Like, are there non-Christians who can express this kind of thing? I mean, I guess we'll leave that for another episode on, like, universalism and the question of, Christian Platonism or whatever, and whether that's the real thing or not. But Eckhart, at least for me, he's speaking my language now, and, like, I like him for that. So sermons are all available online. You should check out a few of these, especially if you're interested in the idea of, like, union with God, or theosis, as I think the Eastern Church calls it. There's a lot of that kind of imagery. There's that famous quote from Eckhart. I didn't type it down for this episode, but where he says something like, the eye, E-Y-E, the eye by which I see God is the same eye by which God sees the world, or me, or something like that. And so there's this suggestion that, like, basically what is looking out from me, at least when I'm in this state with Eckhart, like, is God. I mean, that's the idea. Anyway. All right. Thanks for listening. See you next time.